Hello and welcome back to the GamecockScoop.com podcast, the official podcast of GamecockScoop.com on Rivals. I'm Caleb, as always, joined by Alan, and we are going to talk mostly about the spring game, which is this coming weekend, Big Gamecock Weekend, as it's been known for the last couple of years here. And we'll talk about some of the other aspects of Big Gamecock Weekend as well. Obviously, there's a pretty important baseball series happening this weekend as well. Some recruiting notes, a lot more of that on the weekly recruiting wrap up on GamecockScoop.com later this week, but really it'll be tomorrow. But let's start with a quick, I guess, recruiting note. Right now, I think Ryan Montgomery, the top target for South Carolina, is getting set to announce. We will not ruin that announcement. But if you were on the Insiders Forum this morning, I kind of put my 2 cents on what's going on there. And if I see it go live during the course of the show, I'll work in a couple of notes on that. But yeah, you can check out the Insiders Forum on GamecockScoop.com if you want to know a little more there before he announces in the next few minutes. Another big recruiting note happened earlier this morning. It kind of took place over the course of a week. We didn't even have time to talk about it on the podcast because that happened after our last show. But Cam Scott, who is the top South Carolina basketball recruit in the state of South Carolina for 2024, had originally committed to Texas, worked his way out of the national letter of intent that he had signed there. That was Sunday, that officially got announced.
Yeah. It was a quick turnaround. I think it was Monday, yeah. And then this morning at Lexington signing ceremony, he commits.
Yeah, and we talked a bit about that too on whenever he announced on the article that I put on GamecockScoop.com and the additional notes I put. But he said he wanted to stay closer to home, so it kind of tipped his hand at that point. Before, in the process, it was kind of Texas, Auburn, South Carolina were the top three before he committed to Texas. This morning, he decided to complete that flip and commit to South Carolina. That's a pretty huge commitment. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit. That makes 3 straight years, and now that Lamont Paris has signed the top basketball player out of the state of South Carolina, which is something his predecessor struggled a lot with. Oftentimes, that person was kind of getting away. So you got Gigi Jackson in 2022, Colin Murray Boyles in 2023. Granted, he spent his last year in Utah, but he's a South Carolina guy. And then this year with Cam Scott. Cam Scott's the 2024 Gatorade Player of the Year for the state of South Carolina. Really big get, I think, for the future of this program, and should really make an immediate impact, I think.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Colin Murray Boyles there, and I think that's a good place to kind of go off this. One, they're close to each other. Grew up AAU, played together, friends. I know Colin was a big part of this decision. And two, you look at the impact that Colin had last year on this team, even missing the first month of the year, comes in, immediately changes things in the front court. Probably the highest ceiling player on the roster last year. And then you look at what Cam Scott can be. That's some immediate help. In the backcourt, you do kind of feel like you're leaning more towards having threes on the roster with, Zach Davis is back and Miles Studi's back. And obviously he's not a three, but Colin, your guard play with Michi transferring and Talon being out of eligibility was a little bit questionable. I still think you need another guard right now. I think Jacoby Wright and Cam Scott are kind of the two best you have. Lost Dibba in the portal too. But that was a position you needed help in. And even if he is more of a two guard and you still need a point guard, I think he will play immediately and he will play a lot immediately.
Yeah, and I do think that a big is one of the biggest things that they are targeting in the portal right now. I'll have a little bit more on that list in the weekly recruiting wrap up as well. I did see one of the targets, Federico's older brother.
Yeah, ended up at Texas Tech.
Yeah, exactly. Earlier today. So that one's not going to happen. But yeah, definitely targeting several big men. And then, like you said, I think one more veteran guard makes a lot of sense for them as well. On the football front, since we last spoke, There's been a few commitments. I can't remember who all we already talked about, but you had 3-star defensive back DeMarcus Leach out of Abbeville. You had 3-star defensive end Anthony Addison. He's also in state guy. Where did he
Sumter.
play? I was gonna say Saluda. I'm like, it's not Saluda. And then a 3-star wide receiver in Brian Rowe out of Georgia. All three added to the 2025 class. I believe since we last spoke, maybe we mentioned a couple of those guys. Hard to keep track these days, but I do think that's a pretty big. They're all three big ads for different reasons. You can check out their film rooms on GamecockScoop.com, but maybe the biggest, just from like keeping people in state, some of the same sort of lines that we were just talking about with Cam Scott is Anthony Addison. I think that's a good ad early in the process. I think that's someone that has room to grow into a really good prospect. He's got the frame already. He's a little skinny for 6'5" or whatever he is right now, but got some room to grow. And then there's going to be a ton of on campus this weekend for the spring game.
Yeah.
And I'll have that full list on the weekly recruiting wrap up. So that's something.
Should we talk about the spring game a little bit?
Yeah, let's get into it. So Shane Beamer met with media yesterday to talk about last week's scrimmage and then preview the spring game a little bit. And then a couple of the players got in there as well. My key storyline, I guess, and it's a pretty obvious one and maybe a little like wide reaching, but I think we'll get into a lot of these guys, is just how insane the turnover is in the roster from last year, especially at the skill positions. So you're going to be looking at a lot of new wide receivers from the portal, maybe some young guys stepping up, same at the running back position, obviously figuring out who your quarterback is, although we still tend to think Lenora Sellers has the inside track there. And then at linebacker, a lot of new faces there that are going to immediately contribute. So I guess let's just familiarize people with some of the names to look for at those skill positions this weekend. And it'll be kind of a lot of people's first look at the potential impact that they could make. What position you want to start with?
I kind of am thinking about a lot of these wide receivers just because it's kind of a mishmash, honestly, compared to last year. I think that's as good a place to start as any. Gage Larvadane's a guy I kind of want to see on the field. That's the Miami, Ohio transfer wide receiver. Mazio Bennett, who's another one of those guys who's a true freshman incoming receiver. Was talking about him today. Jared Brown, the Coastal Carolina transfer, is a guy you guys should know. They're going to mostly receiver, but they're going to use him, I would imagine, a little bit out of the backfield, some kind of jet sweep type stuff. He did that at Coastal. Who else? Amari Huggins Bruce from Louisville, another transfer receiver. What am I missing here? Help me out. That's the big four new ones, but
yeah. And then, saw a little bit of Tyshawn Russell last year, but he should factor in. Luke Doty is, of course, going to factor in a name that everyone's very familiar with. To me, the two names that I've heard a ton through the spring are Gage Larvadane, who you just mentioned, and Mazio Bennett. And Lenora Sellers actually specifically shouted out Mazio Bennett and his progress earlier today. Is that kind of what you've been hearing as far as the top two guys? Not necessarily the top two. They're all kind of, we talked about this a little bit before. They're all kind of similar sized, like 5'11" to 6 foot, maybe even like 5'9" to 6 foot. And 160 to 180 sort of, all pretty good tacticians, I guess, as far as route running and everything. But you still don't have that guy other than Nick Harbor that could maybe potentially become a jump ball guy. And then you have that at the tight end position too, which we can get into a little bit. But any other, I guess, buzz that you've heard so far this spring?
Yeah, that tracks. I've heard that too. The Larvadane one's kind of been going around a lot. That's just that's a guy who's played a lot of football, knows his way around the block, and has been a very productive college football player. You can say, it wasn't the SEC, it was the MAC, whatever. You saw what Juice Wells did when he got here from the Sun Belt. Just seems like a professional. He seems like he kind of knows what he's doing, and he's helping some of these younger receivers. Tight end, I've heard a bit about Connor Cox too, just because that room is emptier now. You've got Josh Simon and Brady Hunt in there. Hunt's another guy from the MAC. Simon's kind of your older, experienced guy in the group, but you're going to need one of these younger tight ends to step up, I think. And I kind of think Cox is ahead of Reed McKeska, who he came in with, just because McKeska's been hurt pretty much since he got to campus. Missed more spring ball with an injury. We heard a story from Mazio Bennett about Connor Cox playing really well on special teams, some of the blocking today. So I think that's kind of one to watch too at tight end, just kind of, especially because Michael Smith, the incoming freshman, is not here yet. So at least just for Saturday specifically, I think Connor Cox will play a lot of snaps at tight end.
And yeah, I do think they're excited about Michael Smith's athletic upside. He could factor into the passing game even as a freshman, I think, but could fill out a little bit if he's going to play in line a ton. Might be a guy that's there on a 5-wide situation or something like that.
Right.
But and then you mentioned Joshua Simon, but yeah, I think that is someone that they're going to lean on pretty heavily, especially in the red zone this year, because they don't, at least at the moment, have a ton of those big-bodied guys. So a thing to keep in mind with the spring game, I guess let's go ahead and give this caveat, is you may see one of those guys that we just mentioned get like 20 targets on Saturday, and that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, I remember days of old, Dion Leakhorn on one of those Sprayer teams had like 12 catches for 180 yards or something in the spring game, and then unfortunately he got hurt. Never saw him again. But there are these spring game heroes. They're very fun. It's exciting to talk about. Joshua Burns last year, right? But just because someone gets a lot of targets, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. What's your take on the quarterback battle at the moment? I know Beamer talked a lot about that today. I know both quarterbacks, as in Robbie Ashford and Lenora Sellers, were live for about a quarter of the scrimmage last week again. Both those guys, obviously, their running prowess is part of their game. And then one of the questions that was asked of him yesterday was kind of like what the timeline is for naming a starter. Of course, he didn't give a specific timeline, but he didn't rule out that someone could be named after the spring game. And then just kind of emphasize that even if someone was named after the spring game, you have to, continue to battle, obviously, through the fall to keep that position. But
yeah, I think it's a couple things. Honestly, I'm kind of more interested in Ashford right now. Not that Sellers is a known quantity after appearing in, 3 games last year or anything like that, but Ashford obviously has never played at South Carolina. He has played in the SEC. And the question with him is like, all right, he has athleticism. He moves pretty well. He struggled a lot with accuracy at Auburn. He was under 50%. We've talked about that on this show before. And that is something that you can kind of look at in the spring game. I'm not saying you take everything away from it and you stop the presses, but is he hitting the throws? Are they on target? Is the ball going where he wants it to go? You can still kind of tell that from a spring game just because you can't really fake throwing a football. So I am looking at Robbie Ashford, kind of the accuracy and the control. And then for Sellers, I think it's just command of the offense as much as anything. Leading the team on multiple drives. Not as much the in-game adjustments thing, obviously, when you're facing, your own defense, but still kind of watching him go multiple possessions in a game, go through one. And honestly, even though I don't think he's going to factor into the starting conversation, I'm excited to watch Dante Reno a little bit. He's obviously never played in the South Carolina uniform either, the incoming true freshman from Connecticut. I think Sellers was one of the fun parts of the spring game last year, just because we hadn't seen him, and he kind of popped in that fourth quarter. And it might be fun to see Dante Reno get out there a little bit. I assume second half, fourth quarter, kind of that range.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's something I'm interested to see is how long they go, because Rattler obviously was the entrenched starter last year. He went about a quarter. If Sellers only goes a quarter this year, maybe that's a little bit of a sign, nod to us as well. Point. Yeah. But I agree on the Reno point. The last time anyone really saw him was in the Under Armour game, and he had a little bit of a rough outing that day. Of course, every quarterback on his team had a rough outing because their offensive line was getting destroyed the entire game.
Oh, that's a fair question to ask this weekend too.
Oh, yeah.
Especially I want to see those freshman offensive linemen. If you want to kind of use that as a transition, you've got Cam Pringle, Josiah Thompson, Blake Franks. How does that look? I want to see who's playing together as much as anything. Beamer did talk yesterday that he wants to try to keep some continuity just for the sake of avoiding injuries. And I think everybody remembers what happened to Jalen Nichols last year in the spring game. So he said, he wants left tackles who have practiced with left guards and centers who have practiced with right guards and kind of guys who have been working together this spring to work together Saturday. So we're going to maybe see kind of what they're thinking combination wise, at least to a degree, Saturday up front.
Yeah, and for those of we haven't mentioned this yet, but they'll be doing a draft. It's
Tomorrow.
Friday tomorrow to figure out the teams. They did it last year too. I'm sure there'll be a fun social media post afterwards. Lenore Sellers was the number 1 overall pick last year, and I did think it was funny that Beamer kind of was like, well, there's a little bit of a strategy there too, right? Because they knew Rattler was only going to play 1 quarter, so you don't want to pick the 1 quarter guy as your starting quarterback, and then
the funniest part was he said that one of the teams drafted both long snappers last year, so the other team couldn't kick, and then the coaching staff realized it and made them execute a trade.
Yeah, that's pretty good. So as far as the offensive line goes, you've been able to see a couple open periods there, but we've texted back and forth a little bit about it. It's kind of across the field, kind of hard to see exactly who's lining up where and with what group and whether or not that's even the starters. Based on what you've seen and what you've heard, who would you say right now are your like top 5 or 6 offensive linemen? I kind of have a couple in my head, but
yeah. So I think you kind of got to start with what you know, right? You've got 3 guys back this year who all played significant snaps last year, who should again. That's Treba Balade, Trovon Baugh, Vershawn Lee. I certainly would imagine those 3 will stay where they were and in their spots. That was Tree at left tackle, Vershawn at center. You're not going to mess with that. And Tro at right guard. So I think you can kind of put 3 in place there. It's kind of your left guard and your right tackle. And right now, I think the staff still really wants to see a healthy and likes Case and Henry. He was running with the first unit in that 1 open period that we got, I think it was last Thursday. At right tackle, and then I'm trying to think left guard. I think Torricelli Simpkins, the name fans should know. He was the MEAC offensive lineman of the year at North Carolina. Was it Central or A&T last year?
Central, and yeah, that was a name I wanted to make sure that we brought up, and one that I'm going to be looking at on Saturday as well. But right now he's listed as the backup center, I think, or we think that's where he's at, but I could very easily see him maybe even taking that role as a starter, and then Vershawn Lee moves to one of the guards.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of flexibility there because they do cross-train a lot of these guys. But yeah,
Kamar Bell's another one too, the Florida Atlantic transfer. I think is going to be right in that mix for one of the guard spots.
Yeah, I think that's, some fans may be a little skeptical of transfer offensive linemen, especially from like a lower level to a higher level, which we saw last year maybe not work out. We saw it work out with Nick Gargiulo, but not work out with some of the others. But I really do think Simpkins and Bell are 2 guys that can contribute and will contribute throughout this year. And I mean, I feel like you have to feel like you're in a much better place this time this year than you were last year, especially if you count Nichols going out after the spring game along the offensive line. You're still going to have some growing pains. 2 of those guys you mentioned are true sophomores. I think they're plenty talented, maybe even NFL level talented one day. But it takes some time to fully get integrated and get your body to the place that you want it to be against SEC defensive linemen. But I really expect that unit as a whole to take a big step forward this year.
Yeah, I'm with you completely. I as long as, again, it's the ultimate caveat of all caveats, but as long as they stay healthy or even reasonably healthy, because it's the SEC and linemen get rolled up and that just happens, but not the catastrophic line of injuries you had last year where every week someone was going down. I think it should be a lot better. And you're going to see a lot of those guys on Saturday. Really, think about it. 2 teams, you have 5 each side. You should see a top 10 out there on Saturday.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise me if a couple of those freshmen that you mentioned at the top are working their way in. Hopefully, you have a little bit more depth at this point this year, so that you give those guys a year to mature a little bit and not have to thrust them in the way that Baugh and Babalete were thrust in last year. But it's a double-edged sword. We're last year's in the past now, so that experience from last year, I think, will prove to be very helpful going into this year.
Yeah.
From a coaching standpoint, you have Atkins still as an analyst. You have um, not Sam Survey. Who's the offensive line coach?
Lonnie Teasley.
Lonnie Teasley still there as the main guy. But then this offseason, you brought in Sean Elliott, who's coaching tight ends, but also has the title of run game coordinator. How do you think his addition to the staff might affect this offensive line group and I guess their effectiveness?
Yeah, I'm curious how that works just because he is such an offensive line guy. He's got obviously he was one as a player. He did it at Georgia State, South Carolina, App State, I think, in there too. I don't think it can hurt. I think it's maybe you're not going to see the full benefits right now, just with where the running game is and kind of how it's banged up. But we haven't even mentioned that yet. But Rocket Sanders banged up, GG McDowell banged up. You're not going to see either of them Saturday in the spring game. But yeah, I think it's helpful to have another voice in there, have another body who's kind of just knows what he's looking at, can be a fresh set of eyes. But even if you might not see as much of that Saturday.
Yeah, no, definitely. So here's the really fun position question. Who they going to roll out there at kicker, you think?
You do have a competition now after Mitch Jeter grad transferred to Notre Dame. You've got Alex Herrera and Mason Love. Joe DeCamillis was talking about that last week. I'd like to see both at some point tomorrow. I assume we will, or not tomorrow, Saturday.
Yeah,
I would nod Herrera probably right now for your opening day kicker, week one kicker, just because they gave it to the experienced guy. But also Mason Love, I mean, it's kicking. If you can kick him, you can kick him. Like,
all right, yeah. I mean, really, I think both of the last two kickers started as freshmen. Jeter
that's true,
and
yeah.
who was the other little guy that was in the NFL for a second?
Parker White.
Parker White. There you go. Yeah, I think both those guys got thrust in as freshmen and actually had to make pretty key kicks pretty early on. But like you said, if you can get it through there, you can get it through there. It doesn't really matter your size as much as some of the other positions. Let's look on the defensive side. I think we kind of know what to expect along the defensive front, especially on the interior.
Yeah,
Lenore Sellers actually mentioned, yeah, Lenore Sellers actually mentioned TJ Sanders as someone that's kind of been wreaking havoc in spring practice thus far. On the defensive ends, Gilbert Edmond is a name that's familiar, but is a portal guy that came in. Kyle Kennard out of Georgia Tech is someone that I'm really interested in seeing. Other defensive ends or linebackers that you're kind of looking at in the spring game?
Yeah, Bengali Kamara is a name that's come up in a few press conferences. That's the Pitt transfer linebacker. I'm interested to see how he kind of fits in. Obviously, Dylan Stewart, the five-star incoming true freshman, he'll be playing in Willie B for the first time Saturday. I want to see how he looks. He mentioned today, someone asked him kind of like, what's the goal for you this year? He said, to be a freshman All-American. I was like, oh, okay. He's got the talent to do it, so we'll see how that goes. Kamara and Stewart are two for sure for me. Trying to give you one more name just to kind of round out the conversation. He's not new, but Jaron Willis kind of came on a lot at the end of last year. I think that's someone that can be a very interesting piece, especially if they're in this 3-3-5. I don't know what more you're going to get from him in a spring game because he did play snaps in November last year, but kind of more long-term than just Saturday. I'm interested in him.
Yeah, I think that's a good name. He's kind of playing the backup role to Ben Martin Scott, or he was at the end of last year, who also came along strong as they made that switch to the 3-3-5. And maybe that's another storyline to mention is just what does the defensive alignment look like? I mean, obviously, you're not going to show everything either offensively or defensively in a spring game, but yeah, are they going to mix it up? Are they going to throw some 4-2-5 and some 3-3-5 out there defensively? I would expect so, just because you have so many new linebackers. You mentioned Bengali Kamara. You also got Demetrius Knight, and then some of the youngsters, like you said. So that'll be interesting to just see how they line up.
Yeah, and then just to round out the conversation, secondary, you got some young corners that are interesting. I think you kind of know what you have at safety with Eamon Worry, DQ Smith. You got Keenan Nelson's still there. O'Donnell Fortune's kind of your lead corner. You got Jalen Kilgore back. But like, this is a big year for Judge Collier, his second season. Emery Floyd, same thing. We didn't even mention it, but Zabari Sandy's probably out for the season. He tore his ACL in the second scrimmage last week. Beamer said that yesterday. But I think right now you have 3 players you feel good about at safety, and one of them probably slide kind of closer to the box with Kilgore, even Worry, Smith. You have 1 corner you feel good about with O'Donnell Fortune, the veteran, and then you kind of got a mismatch kind of for that last spot in that secondary in a 3-3-5 or 4-2-5, whether that's Judge Collier or Emery Floyd. David Spalding's been banged up this spring, but he's still there. Kind of interested to see how that looks, especially with kind of who's on what teams and who's playing together and kind of how some of the combinations look Saturday.
Yeah, and Vicari Swain's another name there that I think is really interesting that we've heard some buzz about this spring. And then it'll be interesting to see Jelon Kilgore's brother, Gerald, who got a little shout out today from Lenore Sellers, as well as someone that's flash. On the Zabari Sandy note, I really hope he gets back soon and has a chance to contribute, because I think he's an unsung hero, I guess, of South Carolina's roster as it is right now. He was a key element in putting together that 2023 class, especially those DMV guys, and kind of being one of the first bigger names out of that area that committed and then kind of led to the string of all the DMV commitments that we've seen. But yeah, I don't think you end up with a Desmond Umeozulu or even a Nick Harbor if you don't have Zabari.
That's another guy we didn't mention, Umeozulu. Kind of looking at him at one of those edge spots too.
Yeah, this feels kind of like a crucial spring for him, honestly. Came in pretty highly rated, 4-star. Didn't really do much last year. Interested to see if he's bulked up a little bit, which I know he needed to do, and how he's working into that rotation. I haven't heard much about him at all this spring.
Yeah, it's kind of interested to see how do the snaps look? How are the reps split up? Kind of who does the staff want to get a better look at in a game setting? Yeah, I think we've pretty much hit the spring. I guess I'll close it here before we transition to baseball. What's a successful spring game to you? Someone asked Lenoris this today, and he said just no turnovers. That was kind of his thing. Shane's talking about just wanting to evaluate. With the knowledge of the score and whatever, obviously doesn't matter, what do you kind of think would make a successful spring game besides no injuries?
I would say no injuries first, for sure, always. Like we mentioned last year, Jalen Nichols going down, that ended up being a pretty crucial injury that bled into the 2023 season. So definitely no one like that going down. But honestly, I want a little bit more of like fireworks than we saw last year. It started off kind of fun, and then it ended up like 17-17 or something, and
it was 17-3 in the fourth quarter, and then Sellers kind of brought the thing back to life. 2 touchdown drives in the fourth.
Yeah, which that was fun, and them doing the 2-point drills or whatever for overtime was fun. But I want to see a couple electric plays. Let Lenoris get out there and sling it some. I imagine they're not going to let the quarterbacks run too much, although I'm sure they'll take off and get 2-hand touched or whatever for 20 yards every now and then. But some explosive plays on offense, and then we kind of just went over it, but I'm just really interested in the 2 deep. What do you think the value, I guess, of a spring game is? This is something that Beamer talked about a little bit yesterday in his presser, but he was kind of just talking about those guys that show up under the lights that maybe haven't shown up over the last 3 weeks. Now, granted, I imagine if you didn't show up at all over the last 3 weeks and you show up under the lights, that's still not going to account for much. But do you think that there is some value to this one game setting in the spring?
I think it's kind of the combination thing I keep coming back to, but like you are trying to figure out, especially with this much turnover on the roster, who works well together, what guard plays well next to what tackle, what two safeties are communicating well together. I think it's that as much as anything. And you can get that from, well, we can't because we don't watch them, but the staff can get that from the scrimmages too. They've done the last 2 weekends, but seeing in the closest thing you're going to have to a game setting between now and week 1, because like Beamer said yesterday and has said to us a lot, they don't get a preseason game in college football. What players work well together, how the communication on the back end is. I think that's kind of the main value here. I don't know if it's as much individual. It's just kind of seeing how the systems function together, having never been a football coach saying that.
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said there. And really just like maybe there's a couple people like we're in the portal period right now, but we're about to enter the craziest part of the portal period, I think, after the spring game takes place. It's a chance for both coaches and players to kind of evaluate where they're at right now, and how they're progressing through their college career and the fit and all of those sorts of things. And that was something that Beamer talked a little bit about yesterday too. They'll have meetings on the Monday after the spring game, while the portal period's open, which is kind of crazy. Because we saw this last year. Sometimes you might see something on Twitter before you even had a chance to have the conversation or whatever. But it's an important time because they're still going to go get some wide receivers probably. They're still going to go get some offensive linemen probably. They're right up against the scholarship limit.
They're at 85 right now, yeah.
So there's going to be some changes made after this weekend too. So that'll be interesting to see. All right, let's talk a little bit of baseball. We were very doom and gloom last week. We've been on this roller coaster all week or all year, right? Where we're like, oh, maybe they got it figured out, and then like, no, they're exactly who we thought they were.
You ever seen the Dennis Green clip? Like, I think it was like a 2005 or 2006 game when he was coaching the Arizona Cardinals. They they blew the game pretty badly. He's like, they are who we thought they were. And it's like an all-time press conference rant. We let them off the hook anyway.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the way I've felt every other week throughout the baseball season thus far. And then every other week, I have a little bit of hope. So I think I'm in a hopeful turn right now because last weekend they win a midweek against a ranked North Carolina team, and then they win 2 of 3 at Florida, finally get a road SEC series under their belt. So you go 3-4, 3-4 against ranked teams last weekend. You win a scrappy game last night against a pretty good Citadel team. Midweeks are always hard, especially on the road. And then you really set up, I think, the most crucial 2 weeks of the season, where you're going to host number 1. Are they still number 1 right now?
They're number 2 in the new poll, but still really, really good Arkansas.
Really, really good. Number 2, Arkansas, and then a top 10, or they were last week. I haven't looked at the new poll, but a top 10 ranked.
I think number 4 now because they swept Auburn last weekend, Kentucky.
Yeah, exactly. And those are back-to-back weekends here. What has to happen here? I mean, obviously, if you win both series, you're going to skyrocket yourself into you're going to skyrocket yourself into the polls. But let's assume that's not the most likely scenario. What do you think is a continue to get by, continue to kick the can, continue to be in position for hosting a regional postseason wise or whatever?
Yeah. Okay. I'm kind of 2 minds here. Like it goes. I think we were texting about this Saturday. Like if you go 3-3 the next 2 weekends, let's say you take 2 out of 3 in one series, lose 2 out of 3 in the other, you're still in pretty good shape. You're above 500 in the league when the schedule is going to turn for you. You'll get Missouri and Georgia the 2 weekends after that. That's fine. Like I don't think anyone would say 3-3 against 2 of the top 4 teams in the polls is bad, but it's also kind of this conversation we always have, right? Like, is that where the program is? Is that where the expectation is? Is going 3-3 in 2 home series kind of where it is right now? What does that say long term? All those things we talked about on the show before. Like, you win the series in Gainesville, but then you also kind of dissect those games individually. And it's like, okay, you get a good start from Eli Jones Friday. That's kind of one of your few consistent pieces all year. You win that game 10-3.
Yep. I'll say the Friday game is inarguable. You dominated that game. Nice game.
Yeah. Saturday, you take a 9-3 lead. Offense is doing well. Ty Good was fine, and you kind of piggybacked him with Roman Kimball, got to the late innings. Bullpen has a mess. You have to cling to a 9-8 win with the true freshman Tyler Pitzer pitching out of a jam in the ninth inning. And then Sunday, you get down, was it 5-1 in the second inning? And the offense kind of battles back, but you're still, was it 1 for 15 runners in scoring position? And you lose that game 11-9.
Yeah. Also, how do you score 9 runs with 1 for 15 with runners in scoring position? That was kind of crazy, but
it's what we've had all year. It's what we've talked about all year. They're just kind of finding ways to get it done. They're finding ways to win. I will say that for this team, for as much as we have been kind of doom and gloom. I mean, even last night, you're not hitting the ball great. The wind's kind of blowing in off the harbor. Well, you get a big swing from Will Tippett out of the 9-hole for a homer. And then Garrett Gainey shuts the door in the 8th and 9th inning. So you found a way to win a game last night, too. And maybe that's just kind of what it's going to have to be for this team, just finding ways to win.
Here's a fun question. Based on what you've seen thus far, are they overachieving, underachieving, or kind of like right where you would expect them based on the talent of this team, based on the lineup, based on what we thought going into the season?
I think it's underachieving, even though the record's still okay. You're 26-11 overall and 8-7 in SEC play, but I don't think anyone would argue that the offense isn't where you thought it was going to be, especially after how good it was last year with mostly the same players. So I would say underachieving overall, but I do think you've kind of overachieved expectations pitching-wise. You've got some, we talked about it before, some freshmen who've kind of come along nicely. You saw Pitzer last night pitch pretty well again, and Saturday. You've gotten some good stuff on weekends out of Ty Good. Eli Jones has been what you thought. So underachieving overall, but maybe slightly overachieving pitching-wise, which I guess means you're really underachieving offensively.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If you would have told me preseason that Roman Kimball was going to be as up and down as he has been, I would have been pretty worried about the pitching staff. But some other guys have stepped up that maybe we didn't anticipate. But I would agree. I think underachieving, and so the question still remains, I guess, can they peak? It's time, right? If you're going to start towards that peak, it's now. That it's got to happen. And I don't know. It's like they've won a lot of games by earning a lot of walks and hitting some timely home runs. Otherwise, their batting average with runners on has to be, we've talked about this several weeks in a row, has to be in the bottom, I don't know, 25% of the country. It feels like something that could come back around, but maybe this team just is who they are. They get walks and they hit home runs, and some nights that'll work out and some nights it won't.
That's kind of where I lean. I guess kind of big picture, like you won 16 SEC games last year. That was just about enough to host a regional. You got the second to last spot in that top 16. You are on pace for exactly 16 right now. You are, I think, 14th in RPI right now, which of course we know is a big metric. You want to be in that top 16. You are like right on that hosting bubble. I think still on the good side of it right now with 5 weeks to go. Obviously, a lot can change, but you can play your way out of that pretty quick, and you can play your way out of that pretty quick with what they have on the schedule the next 2 weekends. So it's time to at least tread water for 2 weeks and then maybe pick up some steam when the schedule turns. But you got to at least tread water the next 2 weeks, I think. Your margin for error, at least for hosting, is not that big.
Yeah, I think if you go 2-4 over the next 2 weekends, your margin for error is very tiny, but you could still go on a run and make it happen.
Yeah.
If you do worse than that, it's gonna feel
get real tight.
Yeah, exactly. It's
and I think if you go 3-3, like I said, like you're still over 500 in the league coming out of that stretch before the schedule turns, where you get Mizzou and Georgia, like I said, those next 2 weekends, who are, I think, 2 of the bottom 5 or bottom 6 in the conference right now. Like, you can take those series, and then you're starting to look at that 15, 16 win range, which is about where you want to be.
I do think that it's pretty telling that the number 2 team in the country is coming to town at Founders this weekend. And instead of us talking about what they need to do to win, we're like
talking about treading water.
How do you tread water? Yeah, to me, that's still not what South Carolina baseball is or wants to be. And maybe that's the point at this point.
Yeah, it's kind of what we were texting about after the Saturday game, and kind of what I was saying a few minutes ago. But yeah, that's kind of where it is right now. And that doesn't mean this team still can't get something done, but I think maybe that's how you answer the question you asked, that are they underachieving? Well, in February, did we think we'd be talking about treading water in April? No. So I guess they are probably underachieving.
Yeah. Well, we will have full coverage this weekend of that Arkansas series. I will have some recruiting news posted tomorrow about the spring game visitors and a couple of other notes as recruiting momentum continues to pick up. And then we'll have full coverage of the spring game on Saturday night. Alan will be there. We'll have some analysis after the fact, probably have for the next month or so, just some retrospective looks at a lot of stuff that's happened this spring. But we'll be back to talk about all of that next week on the GamecockScoop.com podcast. Until then, we'll see you.